وين نبدأ يا جماعة؟ Okay, today we'll continue with the same chapter. In a previous lecture, we have discussed one of the models which describes group formation. Today we are going to discuss another model which is describing stages of a group development. This model is known as punctuated equilibrium model. Now, the five-stage model which we have discussed earlier in a previous lecture, it gives us some understanding about how groups formed and what the stages usually groups go through in order to form a group. Now, there was a lot of criticism to that model which we have discussed in a previous lecture. Today we are going to discuss another model. What is so special about this model that it was proposed in order to describe how temporary groups are formed. So we are not talking about all types of groups. Mainly here we are talking about temporary groups. Now, according to this model, there are 6 stages. We are going to go through those stages. It is a very simple model, but maybe it is more practical comparing it to the previous model that we have discussed. Now, at the first stage, usually the groups are into identifying group direction or setting the group direction. Here we are talking about agreeing on the purpose, what are the main objectives, what should the group accomplish at the end of the work or task, and so on. After that, usually groups are into the first phase of interior. Now, when you talk about interior and talking about the first phase, it means, of course, that there is a second phase. Here we are talking about 2 phases. Now, in the first phase of interior, the group here is more into implementing some of the activities which is related to the assignment or task itself. Okay. Usually at this stage, we are talking about the initial engagement with the assignment. Usually there are some problems which is going to raise or some deficiencies which is going to come up and so on. Usually the group at this stage try to solve those problems, agree on some common understandings, how to deal with different situations, or even sometimes they develop some sort of, we can say, regulations, not necessarily a very formal regulations, but at least there should be some sort of guidelines and so on. After that, usually the group is into the halfway point transition. At this stage, usually the group is more capable of dealing with most of its problems or situations and so on. And after that, usually due to that, there are some major changes which is brought by the groups. Why? Because the groups at this stage, they are more efficient. They have more experience with the assignment or the task. They develop some sort of mechanisms to deal with different circumstances or situations. They are more capable of solving different problems that they face, and that's why they can brought here they can introduce major changes which is related to the assignment itself. Later on, the group is going to go through the second phase of interior. Of course, comparing the first phase to the second phase, we can say that the second phase is associated with more results which is related to the assignment, due, of course, to the accumulated experience of the group dealing with the assignment. Now, the final stage, it is the accelerated activity stage. We said that temporary groups usually they have deadlines within a specified time limit. They must finish the assignment or accomplish the task. That's why at the end, usually the groups are more, if there is anything which is lacking, they need to back up here or finish within the time. So there are a lot of things to finish the assignment, to do. If there are some reports to be submitted, for example, to the management, they need to make sure that they have accomplished the assignment according to the specified standards and so on. So usually there are more activities here. We describe it as accelerated activity. Why? Because the group is more active here in order to finish at time with, of course, it's important also here to reach the specified standards which is related to the assignment itself. As I have said, this is another model. The first model, there was a lot of criticism to the first model. This model sounds more practical, but of course one of the most important points again here to consider is that this model was developed in order to describe how temporary groups deal with assignments or tasks. Okay. Now, another topic that we are going to discuss today is group properties. Now, when we talk about group properties, here we are talking about some, we can say, factors or elements which should help us to characterize different groups. Or somehow it is going to help us to differentiate between different groups. Of course, not only to differentiate in terms of characterizing the groups, also to know how those properties might affect the group performance. All those issues that we are going to discuss, finally, we need to discuss how it is going to affect the group performance. Now, when you talk about group properties, there are 5 main properties here. The first one is rule, and of course we are going to discuss in detail all those points, but first let us go through those points. The second one is norms, status, size, and cohesiveness. Okay, so those are the 5 main elements that we are going to discuss. Of course, we are going to start with the first one, which is rules. Now, the first group property is rule. Now, when you talk about rule, here we are talking about a set of expected behaviors, okay, which is, of course, here we are talking about those behaviors which is expected by individuals within the social unit. Of course, when you talk about the social unit, here we are talking about the group. So each individual is expected to behave according to a specified pattern. Now, according to whether the individual is performing or behaving according to this pattern or not, here we can discuss the rule itself, whether it is compliant to the expectations or there are differences. Now, again, when we talk about a rule here, we are talking about a set of expected behavior patterns attributed by individuals. Okay, of course, this individual is a member in a group, and this behavior pattern is expected by the group members. Okay, now when you talk about the rule, there are some points here that we need to discuss. One of those is rule identity. When you talk about rule identity, here we are talking about up to what extent the real behaviors of the individual is in accordance with the expectations of the group. So the more the behaviors which is brought by an individual is inconsistent with the group expectations, or with the rule, I mean here, with the expected behavior pattern, the more we say that there is rule identity. Now, there are other circumstances here where there might be some differences. Like, for example, okay, a second point to discuss, and then we can talk about those differences, rule perception. Okay, now it might be in some cases the rule expected is something, and how I perceive the rule, it might be something else. When we talk about rule perception, here we are talking about the individual, him or herself, how he or she is understanding the rule required to be played by the individual. Okay, now let us start to talk about the differences here before continuing with other points. Sometimes there might be differences between rule identity and rule perception. In other words, sometimes maybe the expected rule is something, and how individuals within a group are understanding the rule, it might be something else. What so if there are differences between the rule identity and rule perception? What is going to happen? How this is going to affect a group? Yes?
There will be conjecturing between both of them because you are understanding something and they need something else.
Okay.
So this will affect performance negatively.
Oh, so if the expectations are not in accordance with the understanding, we expect here some problems which is related to performance. If I am expected to play a certain role and I understand the rule differently, it means that I'm not going to perform according to the standards. That's why at the beginning I said when we discuss those properties, we need to always at the end find out how this is going to affect a group performance. Okay, so if the ideal situation here that there should be accordance, okay, between rule identity and rule perception. Not only rule identity and rule perception, there is another thing here which is rule expectations. Now when you talk about rule expectations, we are not talking about the identity, how the rule is designed by the organization. Here we are talking about others, how they are expecting individuals within a group to behave. So we are talking about the group expectations here in general. Okay, so we have rule identity, we have rule perception, and we have rule expectations. If there is any conflict between those, it means that this is going to affect the performance negatively. Okay, now why? Because if there is any sort of inaccordance, we say that there is a rule conflict here. When we talk about rule conflict, we are talking about the differences that we have already discussed. If there is no consistency here between rule identity, for example, and rule perception, or between rule perception and rule expectation, even though it is not discussed at the same way in the book, but even if there is discrepancy here or there is inconsistency between rule identity and rule expectations, also we expect some problems here. If the organization is designing the rule in a certain way and the group is understanding the rule in a certain way, and accordingly there are some expectations here which is not inconsistent with rule identity, also we expect here some problems which is related to performance. So if there are any discrepancies here, or if there are inconsistencies between those points, we expect here to have some sort of a problem. Okay, now one of the experiments which was done in this regard is the Zimbardo's prison experiment. Zimbardo is a professor. He was specialized in psychology. He have conducted an experiment in the college he was teaching in. He used the basement to simulate a jail. So he created a jail. It was a simulation of a jail, and he asked some students to play the role of guards and other students to play the role of prisoners. And the experiment lasted for 2 weeks. At the first 2 days, prisoners and guards, they were not very sure about their rule, what they have to do, and so on. But after that, there was some sort of problems between guards and prisoners, and guards used force here to enforce discipline among prisoners. And within 2-3 days, the guards were playing the role of real guards, and the prisoners were listening and obeying all commands and so on. And this is, it is giving us a very clear indicator about how individuals, how quickly they learn their rules. Okay, and this means that within organizations we can learn individuals how to understand their rules. How can we within organizations learn all individuals within the organization to play the right role? How can we guide individuals to their role within the organization? What organizations can do in this regard in order to learn individuals about their rules? Yes?
Maybe some leaflets, some brochures are guiding them.
What else? Orientation or training in general, it is helpful. What else in addition to that? Yes.
Maybe using the different types of reinforcement for specific behaviors.
Such as?
Well, like if we find that the group is working well, we can give them positive reinforcement in order to retain the activity, their activity or their behavior in general, or a negative to punish them. Or to
if we are talking about incentives and all the disciplinary actions within the organization, it is going to help. What else? Bylaws, regulations. Okay, if we are talking about job descriptions to specify the duties and assignments of each job holder and so on. So we are talking here about different enforcement tools that can be used by the organization. Some of those are regulations, bylaws. We are talking about the disciplinary action. We are talking about motivation policy implemented by the organization. We are talking about also awareness, training, orientation, and so on. It is going to be helpful. Here we are talking about something which is related to perception, how individuals are going to understand their role. And it is important for the organization that individuals understand their real role in order to avoid problems related to role conflict and so on. Why? Because it is going to affect negatively the performance of individuals within the organization. So this is one of the properties which is related to groups. Now another one is norms. Now, when you talk about norms, here we are talking about standards which is controlling behavior. Okay. Now, in the organization, we do not have formally norms. We have bylaws, regulations. After that, there are norms which is developed. But when you talk about groups, between group members, there is nothing formal, especially when we talk about informal groups. Usually, there are norms. Now, those norms are going to control the behavior of individuals. Why? Because individuals are going to show commitment to those norms. So here we are talking about acceptable standards of behavior within the group, within a group, okay, that are those, of course, standard acceptable standards are shared by group members. Now, what is the importance of norms? Again, it is going to control or guide at least the behavior of individuals within a group. And it is the same when we compare it to, again, the formal bylaws within the organization, because here we are talking about the same rule. Because bylaws, it is going to guide or form the behavior of individuals or force the individuals to behave in a certain way. And when we talk about norms, it have the same effect. Why norms have the same effect within groups? Why norms have the same effect within groups? The same effect of bylaws. Yes?
Because these norms are acceptable by all members, so they are all showing the same commitment to these norms and standards, because they know that these norms is acceptable and they have to obey it as it is.
And if we didn't?
But usually we have to, because
okay, now the problem here, if we didn't obey those norms, okay.
You would be like someone who's different from
okay, and maybe the group is going, the group is not going to help this individual in a certain assignments, and maybe they are going to hinder sometimes the efforts of this individual to account, and that's why usually individuals try to commit to show commitment to those norms, okay, because if they did not do so, they are going to face some problems related to their relation with the groups. That's why we say that norms are equally important as bylaws. Why? Because it is shaping or guiding the behavior of individuals within groups. And usually, in most cases at least, individuals, they show high commitment to norms, especially if the group is important for them. Why? Because if they did not do so, they are going to face some problems with other group members. Now, when you talk about the classes of norms, there are a lot of classes of norms. Yani there are norms which is related to performance. There are norms which is related to even when we talk about social relations, how people communicate with each other, others, productivity, even to appearance and other issues. So there is no, we are not talking here about 3 or 4 classifications. We are talking about a lot of classes of norms. It is going to cover all aspects of work. But of course, the importance of those classes are not equal. We cannot say that all those classes are equally important. Always there are some classes which is more important than others. Okay, so again there are a lot of norms here. Some of those are related to performance, appearance, productivity, social arrangement, communications, even issues related to allocation of resources. Again, it is related to all aspects of work. Now, usually, again, as I have mentioned, individuals, in most cases, they show high commitment to norms. One of the experiments in this regard, and it is a very famous experiment, the Hawthorne studies. Maybe you have studied about the Hawthorne studies in different courses. We are going to go through some of the ideas. If you remember, when they have reduced the light, the groups maintained the same level of performance because they show some sort of challenge to the situation. Some groups were isolated and they were observed by a researcher in order to write down all notices. Those groups who were isolated, and at the time that there was the researcher watching the group, they show more efforts, or they exert more efforts to maintain same level of performance. Also, it was noticed that their absenteeism rate was lower than other groups in different places. And when there was some sort of incentives paid in order to increase, and this is very important, how norms are going to affect productivity and performance, incentives were proposed to increase the productivity. Some groups reach a certain limit and they did not respond to the incentives in order to provide protection for other members who were weak members, who of course were not able to reach the required standards. So again, norms here are going to control performance. If those norms are positive, it is going to control performance in a positive way. If those norms are negative, like the ones after a few moments we are going to discuss, it is going to affect performance in a negative way. Again, the Hawthorne studies show us how norms affecting the behavior of individuals within groups. Now, in order to understand more the relation between norms and behavior, there is what we call conformity. Conformity, individuals usually show high interest in commitment to norms proposed or handled by the groups. So this we call conformity. Up to what extent individuals try to gain acceptance by group members, and to gain acceptance by group members, they show commitment to norms, because if they did not show commitments, they are going to be expelled by the groups or isolated by the groups. And in some cases, in the Hawthorne studies, some members who violated the norms were harassed, and sometimes they were beaten, okay, by other group members. Because here we are not talking about formal regulations, we are talking about some sort of informal regulations, which is available among group members. Okay, so conformity here, usually individuals try to gain the acceptance of other group members, and to do so they show commitment to norms. Now, for any individual, there is what we call reference group. The reference group is the group where its norms matching my beliefs or attitudes or behaviors. Okay, so the more there is consistency here between individuals' behavior, beliefs, attitudes, and the group norms, the more we say that this is a reference group. Why? Because this is the group that the individual prefer to be a member of it. Why? Because they share a lot of norms. So this we call reference group. And the third, of course, another issue here that we need to another study that we are going to talk about to show the power of conformance. It is the ACT studies, I think, here. is another professor who conducted an experiment. He created maybe 5-6 groups. Each group there was 7-8 members, and they were giving 2 sheets of paper. The first one, there are 3 lines of different lengths, and the second paper there was only 1 line. This 1 line is identical with one of the lines at the first paper. Okay, so he started different rounds. At the first time, he asked everyone which one is matching a line in the first paper. All the groups, they answered the right question. Okay, the second round he did the same thing, and all the group members, they answered the right. They give the right answer here. Now at the third round, there were members who were asked to say, for example, that A is identical with B, but truly it is not identical. So at the first group, the first one was asked, he gave a false answer. The second one did the same. The third one, the fourth one. There in each group there was a member who do not know about the scenario that they are implementing or the rule that they are playing. In 75% of the cases, one of the individuals at least give one answer to show conformity with others. Though it was very clear that this line is identical to X line, but because others said that this line is identical to Y, and he know that it is not true, but in 75% of individuals, at least in one case, they give a false answer, and that's to show conformity with the group. Okay, though that they are very sure that this answer is wrong, but also they give the wrong answer. And this demonstrated the power of conformity. Sometimes individuals within groups, because they need the group, they show conformity with norms, though it is not matching to their behavior pattern or attitudes or beliefs and so on. Okay. So this is another experiment which it is helpful for us to understand how norms can affect performance of individuals within groups. Okay, now of course we said that sometimes the effectiveness here, it might be negative. Okay, we have discussed earlier deviant workplace behaviors, and we know that those are negative behaviors brought by individuals voluntarily within groups, and usually this is not in accordance with organizational policies or plans, objectives, and so on, and that's why we call it deviant workplace behavior. Of course, there are other titles, or we can call it antisocial behavior or workplace incivility and so on. Now, deviant workplace behaviors, again, it is a negative behaviors which is brought by individuals within groups, and usually individuals, or not usually, sorry, in some cases individuals, they are behaving negatively because they are forced by the group to do so. And again, this is related to conformity issue that we have discussed earlier. Okay, sometimes, for example, like the Hawthorne. Okay, there was a positive effect there where they maintained the same level of production, but when they give them incentives, the group members did not increase the performance to the level desired by the management here, and this is a negative effect. Of course, when you talk about the typology or where norms might affect performance, it might affect production. Like sometimes maybe the employees within an organization, they will develop such sort of a norm where they are going to come late for work, or within work they are going to work slowly, for example. So this is going to affect production. There are other typology here where it is going to, or those individuals, they are not going to deal with property in a safe manner, or they are not going to take care of equipment, tools, machinery, and so on. And usually this is going to increase the maintenance cost, for example. there are political typologies here which is related to alliances, and sometimes those alliances are not in accordance with organizational policy. So when you talk about group norms, again, group norms can influence deviant workplace behaviors. Again, not always, but in some cases, group norms are going to affect deviant workplace behaviors. Of course, it might affect it in a positive way or a negative way. Yani if the norms are negative, then it is going to affect deviant behavior in a negative way, which means here the deviant behavior are going to increase. If it is positive, the norms, then there is going to be more control in deviant workplace behavior, and the behaviors are going to be more in accordance with organizational requirements, goals, policies, and so on. Okay? But again, norms is one of the group property which is going to influence performance of employees within any organization. Any questions? طيب كيف